In April 2022, political commentator Russell Brand informed his audience that the establishment media were engaging in a deliberate strategy of cultural censorship against the general population. According to Russell, the media was constraining the attitudes of the public towards the war in Ukraine by artificially confining their coverage to two parameters: sanctions and escalation.
A consumer who only reads traditional press will see Ukraine coverage confined to the following parameters. Should we stick with just sanctions and sending arms, or up the ante? That sounds like there's an intended outcome. They're not trying to look at all possible outcomes. This sort of cultural censorship must be part of the intention of the state.
Russell went on to explain how this perfectly lined up with Noam Chomsky's theory of manufacturing consent, that the media were keeping the views of the public confined to a tiny box so the public will become brainwashed and complicit with the agenda of the state.
One of Chomsky's famous lessons is the function of the mainstream political media stratagem is to keep your views confined to a tiny little box. Oh, should it be sanctions or should we up the ante? What about like come to some sort of deal or something, some kind of peace? How about we reorganize our whole sanctions or up the ante?
Russell's critique was kind of funny, if this is your style of humour, confidently delivered and draped in the lexicon of human psychology, which all lent him the legitimacy of a seasoned expert, someone who must be analysing and dissecting media events in detail, and from all that experience is now able to pull apart the media's hidden motivations. For this reason, it's not hard to see how the average person who sits down to watch a Russell Brand video immediately starts finding his arguments very persuasive. It's only a skeptical few viewers who might hear Russell saying that the mainstream media are trying to culturally censor the concept of peace, an idea that is so banal that it's known to every 6th grader.
It's when everybody in the world makes friends.
And venture outside of Russell's orbit to check if that's actually what's going on. Is every legacy media outlet suppressing all mention of peace talks? And what they would find is this.
Prime Minister, first, your reaction to the prospect of peace talks between Russia and Ukraine.
The negotiations between Russia and Ukraine about how to possibly bring an end to this conflict, bring an end to this violence.
Russia said it was ready to resume peace talks with Ukraine. Some analysts feel it's really a ruse.
There was hope around the world, certainly, that something would come of these peace talks.
A third round of peace talks is underway today between delegations from both countries.
Where are we with these talks?
A fourth round of peace talks now underway.
And when a war becomes pointless, there must surely be a chance of peace.
Do you think we could see a breakthrough in peace talks?
It's important to continue these talks, and while everybody would like to see an end to the violence,
he is ready to discuss a deal with Russia.
Patrick, what's the latest on these talks?
Again, there is hope for what might happen at these talks.
Peace talks between delegations from Ukraine and Russia are underway in Turkey.
One of Russia's most notorious oligarchs is helping to broker a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine.
Begin with that breaking news and a potential sign of diplomacy or success from diplomacy in the war on Ukraine.
Contrary to everything Russell told his audience, the concept of peace talks and making a peace deal was discussed extensively by legacy media outlets almost every day through late February, the whole of March, and early April, only fading from the national conversation when, in April, Ukraine and Russia publicly walked away from the negotiating table, with both sides citing concessions they wanted that the other side wasn't willing to give. The idea that the concept of peace talks was purged from our consciousness by the media in order to control our opinions, in context, it doesn't make any sense. When someone tells you that a reality shift in PSYOP is being perpetrated by those in power, which can all be explained by an academic theory, that display of perceptiveness and intellect can be incredibly compelling. But what happens when you realize that the phenomenon they've told you about isn't actually happening? It transforms from being an intelligent critique into an elaborate fraud. This is a guy who wants you to think he's clever for noticing something that you never had the chance to see for yourself. And you never had the chance to see it because he made it up. Over the course of this video, we're going to be establishing Russell Brand as a political commentator who regularly misleads his viewers with grandiose lies steeped in intellectual jargon. And then, we're going to be reinforcing the point that Russell is a liar again and again and again and again and again and again. Eventually branching into a wider discussion about the political ideology Russell subscribes to, which requires him to assume a very liberal relationship with facts, evidence, and rationality. I want to qualify before we get properly stuck into this, that this video is not going to address the serious allegations made against Russell Brand in September 2023. I don't want anyone to watch this video and come away thinking that they can correlate the way a person might lie for political reasons in a YouTube video to a propensity for serious criminal misconduct. The two things are not the same. However, by proxy, we will be attacking a defensive argument that Russell and his followers have been wheeling out in response to those allegations. That Russell is being attacked by the establishment for telling the truth.
It's been clear to me, or at least it feels to me, like there's a serious and concerted agenda to control these kind of spaces and these kind of voices. And I mean my voice along with your voice. I'm aware that you guys have been saying in the comments for a while, watch out, Russell, they're coming for you, you're getting too close to the truth.
He's winning because he is a man who generates his own content under his own speed, under his own expense. Yeah, he is a threat to all of these newspapers. The reason he is a hero to millions of people, millions who will be watching this channel, is because of his position on politics in the last 3 years.
It's time to look at the man behind the brand and work out what Russell's heroic, truthful positions are all about.
Drop.
Now, before we start rattling around under the hood of Russell's YouTube channel, I'm going to say a few words of recommendation about an app that kindly sponsored this video, my first ever sponsor, Ground News. Making the vids that I do, I often get commenters asking me, Timba, so you're saying I can't trust random pundits on the internet?
I think we might be seeing a 49-state landslide.
Where'd you expect me to get my news from? And to them, I would say, nobody has a monopoly on the truth, and the only news reporter you should be listening to is your own internal monologue, which you have appropriately informed with a well-rounded information diet. In order to appropriately inform my internal monologue, I use Ground News. It's an app and website that combines news articles from all around the world, showing how stories are being covered from different angles across the political spectrum. Every story comes with a visual breakdown of the political bias, reliability, and headlines. Let me show you how it works. Take a look at recent reporting on the back and forth between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump over what's going on with the presidential debate. On Ground News, I can see that this story has been covered by over 300 sources. But here's the thing, only 15% of those sources lean right, which means that the right are leaving an information void on this topic, which allows the conversation to be monopolized by left and center-leaning news publications. If I scroll down, I can also see the factuality information and ownership. For this story, I can also see that this percentage of the reporting outlets are owned by media conglomerates. I can also see every article about this topic and compare headlines. Looking over these headlines, I noticed this article from the left-leaning Associated Press sought to positively capture the energy at the Kamala rally in the framing of the story, while this article from the right-leaning Washington Examiner framed Kamala's challenge as goading and taunting behavior. What's interesting is seeing how news events like these are being leveraged to create certain perceptions of the moral character of these presidential candidates. And it got me thinking about how these might go on to inform Americans' views about who they want to vote for in November. I've been using Ground News to sense check whether my personal assumptions about the political leanings of Russell Brand's sources were accurate. And outside of video making, I've also found Ground News really useful for getting the blind spot news updates in my inbox, which tell me all about issues that are not being covered well by left-wing news outlets I tend to read. I think it's good stuff what Ground News are doing, because ultimately they're giving people useful tools for navigating our complex media landscape without leveraging any particular agenda themselves or casting any judgment about what opinions you ultimately form. Go to ground.news/Timbah to check it out. You can subscribe through my link for less than $1 a month or get 40% off unlimited access to the Vantage subscription, which is what I use. When you subscribe, you're doing me a solid, of course, but you're also supporting an independent platform trying to make the news more transparent for people. The video, You Aren't Going to Like This, published in August 2022, is a great microcosm of the numerous ways in which Russell can turn molehills into mountains through exaggeration, dogmatism, and misrepresentation.
There are toxic heavy metals in your baby food, and the FDA and the government are going to continue to allow it. Can we trust them then?
In this video, Russell covers a CBS News report and some other related articles about findings that there are high levels of toxic heavy metals in baby foods. Here is the information Russell relays to his audience. Point number 1. There shouldn't be any toxic metals in baby foods.
I'd like to propose a motion to have no deadly toxic metals in any baby food.
Point number 2. If there are toxic metals in baby foods, all of those products should be recalled immediately, all of the companies should be sued, and a completely new system should be established.
Withdraw all those products immediately, sue all of the companies involved, and set up new systems for ensuring that babies are fed healthy foods, and if they're not healthy, at least not poisonous.
Point number 3. Because this hasn't happened, this points to there being a conspiracy between big food manufacturers and the FDA, who want to pump out cheaply made foods containing arsenic for high profit margins.
So I suppose what we're beginning to see is a picture where there is a collaborative relationship between the manufacturers of these baby foods and the FDA. Their products get cheaper to make, higher profit margin, and then they cut corners and somehow there's arsenic in your baby's dinner now.
Point number 4. This is part of a bigger push by powerful entities to keep the population sick and unhealthy so they become easier to push around.
Almost as if the people charged with looking after us would prefer it if we were sick and unhealthy because there's some matrix and network of business interests that would benefit from a population of people eating bad food, then being just all weak and vulnerable and easy to push about. Almost as if they don't want strong, vibrant people confronting power. My director doesn't look happy with this.
The lampshading with the tinfoil hat here implies Russell might be joking, but in another video I found him making the exact same point very sincerely.
It can't be that that big food and big pharma are in lockstep to continually benefit from an unhealthy America.
So I think it's fair to assume that regardless of whether he packages it with humor or behind a veil of irony, Russell means what he says. In his mind, this is a conspiracy engineered by big food to weaken the population. Let's talk about the flaws in Russell's argument. The first one is that he has wrongly identified what is causing arsenic food contamination. He gives away the fact that he's misunderstood the issue at several points. Firstly, when he blames the problem on pre-packaged foods.
Right away, what that tells you is pre-packaged baby foods is not the best way to get food to babies.
And secondly, when he says that the correct amount of arsenic in our food should be 0.
I'd like to propose a motion to have no deadly toxic metals in any baby food. The agency's closer to 0 plan. That's the plan, closer to 0. How about 0?
If you look at this appendix of a report conducted by the Food Standards Agency, which analyses levels of arsenic in fruits and vegetables in the UK, you quickly see the problem with what Russell is suggesting. Cabbage contains arsenic. Strawberries have arsenic in them. Onions contain arsenic. These fresh fruits and vegetables have not come from the baby food packaging factory, so what's going on? The piece of information Russell is unaware of is that the arsenic is in our soil. Some arsenic is naturally occurring in earth minerals, but a bigger part of it comes from insecticides which have been used by farmers since the early 1900s. These insecticides were banned in the 1980s, but it's going to take a long time for the arsenic to completely disappear from the soil. It's a problem all over the world, and we're all still growing our fruits, vegetables, and grains in that soil. A lot of baby foods are made from rice, which is especially susceptible to arsenic contamination because it is highly absorbent and takes in a lot of water, minerals, and toxins from the soil around it. Small amounts of arsenic are not going to harm you, you're probably eating it all the time, but larger amounts could cause risks for developing babies, so the FDA wants to keep proportions of arsenic within a reasonable margin. 0 is not a reasonable margin.
Do you want arsenic in your baby's food? I've got babies, here's my choice. No!
So your children have never eaten an apple, Russell. They've never eaten a carrot. You kept them away from raspberries, have you? Fruit Gestapo. Springboarding from his initial misunderstanding of the issue, Russell leaps to the conclusion that big food manufacturers are to blame for this because they're chasing high profit margins.
When you find yourself in a situation where there's toxic metals in baby food, it shows you that there are certain food companies that evidently have a great deal of sway. As big food acquires more small companies, they're able to leverage more power through lobbying and control of the FDA, meaning that their products get cheaper to make, higher profit margin, and more arsenic for everyone. And that's got to be a good thing, right?
We can see from a consumer report conducted in 2012 that this is not the case. From the proportions of inorganic arsenic found in the samples, you can see that smaller, family-run brands such as Cajun Country Rice and Della Rice contained more arsenic than all the rice analysed from Target, all but one of the rice brands analysed from Whole Foods, and a similar amount to the rice sold by Walmart. If big manufacturers cutting corners is the problem, why does their rice contain less arsenic than the rice sold by smaller brands? Russell's claims make no sense. Russell goes on to exaggerate the severity of the issue by blatantly misrepresenting a statistic.
Baby foods are tainted with up to 91 times more inorganic arsenic than the Food and Drug Administration's maximum allowable levels.
Russell seems to have chopped off some words at the end of the sentence here. The article actually says 91 times more inorganic arsenic than the maximum allowable levels in bottled water. That reference to bottled water, which Russell removes from his quote, is essential to understanding the meaning of the sentence, because arsenic in water is far more toxic to humans than in food, and therefore water has a drastically lower maximum allowable level. If you compare the amount of arsenic you find in food to the maximum allowable level for water, of course, the proportions are going to be off the charts. The highest arsenic reading for any of the actual finished baby food products in the report was 180 parts per billion. Still higher than it should be, but not tantamount to poisoning a baby.
It doesn't matter where your baby's from. We'll poison the little bastard.
Finally, we get to Russell's closing flourish, which is to allege a conspiracy between big food manufacturers and the FDA to rubber stamp dangerous products in service of higher profit margins.
In a sense, what you want to feel is that the regulatory bodies that officiate over the standards of products are operating in the service of ordinary people, of the consumer, of the public, however you see us. Not that they're just an agency that sort of rubber stamp and sign off products so that big food can continue to make profit with potentially dangerous products. There is a collaborative relationship between the manufacturers of these baby foods and the FDA.
If there was a collaborative relationship between the FDA and big food manufacturers to pull the wool over the eyes of the public and squeeze profits out of them, one thing we certainly wouldn't expect to see is the FDA publicly investigating their alleged business partners. And yet, the report that is the origin of so many of Russell's stats leads with the declaration that the testing of the baby food products was paid for by the FDA. So Russell is asking us to believe that the FDA are in this collaborative relationship with big food manufacturers trying to squeeze profits out of consumers, but the FDA is also like, I know, why don't we sabotage our secret business partners' profits by publicly showing everyone that their food contains high levels of arsenic? The FDA would have to be some of the most incompetent collaborators big food could ever hope to recruit. We also know from scientific studies that arsenic contamination levels are high in Suriname and Thailand, places where the FDA and American big food manufacturers have no jurisdiction. How does Russell's FDA conspiracy theory account for what's going on over there? Are Thailand farmers in on this conspiracy too? Are they arbitrarily adding arsenic to their rice so America can look slightly better by comparison? There's an independent watchdog organisation called Healthy Babies Bright Futures, cited positively by Russell's sources, who confirm that their findings line up with the FDA's national testing. They also confirm that big food manufacturers are not the problem here, because homemade baby formula and family brands contain the same amount of toxins as baby food from retailers. They say that their criticisms of the FDA are not that it is at the centre of a baby poisoning conspiracy, but rather that the FDA's timeline for setting new guidelines is too slow, and the FDA's industry-wide targets are not aggressive enough.
Almost as if the people charged with looking after us would prefer it if we were sick and unhealthy, because there's some matrix and network of business interests that would benefit from a population of people eating bad food, then being just all weak and vulnerable and easy to push about.
We are, frankly, leagues away from having evidence of a sinister conspiracy, and yet none of that stops Russell Brand from confidently manifesting one through his commentary, whilst along the way to that conclusion getting every single fact of the situation completely wrong. He said that arsenic came from the baby food packaging factory. That was bullshit. It comes from the soil. He said that big food manufacturers were causing the problem by chasing high profit margins. That was totally wrong. All rice farmers are affected by this. He directly hid bits of text to make the problem seem 50 times worse than what the data actually showed. He accused the FDA of being secret collaborators when they were the ones paying to test the products. And so when he gets to his allegations of a big conspiracy, it's like, why would anyone believe you? You've shown you can't even accurately describe or quantify the problem you're supposedly concerned about, not to mention a willingness to blatantly misrepresent journalists' work. We're also seeing the primacy of the us versus them narrative which permeates all of Russell's thinking. Russell points his finger at establishment institutions and then draws a neat line in the sand and positions ordinary people as victims on the other side. This allows him to indignantly play the role of the noble savior, fighting for their rights. The thing is, the more familiarity you have with the topic Russell is covering, the less clear that line in the sand between oppressor and oppressed becomes. We know from Consumer Report findings that rice from southern states such as Arkansas, Louisiana, Missouri, and Texas had higher levels of arsenic than rice from literally anywhere else. So if the FDA and the government really wanted to get serious and protect consumers, they could impose tougher regulations on southern farmers and encourage manufacturers to pivot their supply chains to safer places, perhaps California, or maybe even overseas to India, whose arsenic concentrations in food are much lower, much safer for consumers. But in entertaining that complexity, we immediately lose the black and white narrative of the common people versus the establishment. There are common people on both sides of this issue, American consumers on one and Southern American farmers on the other, with no morally vindicating policy that solves everyone's problems at once. And if the US FDA or government did place strict regulations on Southern farmers, I have an inkling how Russell would react.
Edicts issued by centrist powers that bankrupt their farmers. They want you to be listless little hemorrhoids at the end of their mighty power.
The way Russell brazenly exaggerates the severity of the arsenic contamination issue, dishonestly misrepresents all the facts, and so self-assuredly points to such an improbable conclusion with no evidence. This is a microcosm of the way that small lies are strung together into a layered mosaic on Russell's channel to justify grandiose storytelling about global corruption that Russell has managed to uncover. What should be a bureaucratic problem for food regulators in America becomes an establishment plot to poison babies. It all begs a question. Where is Russell getting his information from? If you were to ask Russell what motivates his research and political commentary, he would tell you that he is driven by skepticism, that he never blindly accepts information at face value, he interrogates and investigates facts with a circumspect, discerning eye.
I'm always circumspect, sometimes skeptical. I always check on myself before I wreck on myself. Not a conspiracy theorist to observe and question patterns and not to blindly accept information. You have to be open-minded and open-eyed about the reality of the information you're being presented. Just blindly and immediately accepting the narrative that you're spoon-fed no longer seems prudent. We want to interrogate and investigate the facts so that we can bring you truth.
Whenever someone ostentatiously self-identifies as a skeptic, I'm always eager to find out where they get their information from. Because as we all know, everything comes with an agenda. Unless you're some truth-seeking robot who only makes judgments after processing all available first-hand information, you have to rely on a network of other people to curate information for you. And how they choose to present things, what they highlight, what they leave out, all of that shapes your thoughts and perceptions as a reader. There are two main types of sources which Russell uses on his channel. The first one is legacy media outlets like The Guardian, Reuters, Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, The Telegraph, and the Daily Mail, amongst others. Typically, these are used for context and background information, with Russell pulling out a few statements to set the scene before he pins down his main arguments. And then the second type of information sources which Russell uses are blogs and independent publications that are animated by anti-establishment politics, the vast majority of which are very far left, and despite being something of a left-wing internet goblin myself, I had never heard of hardly any of these. To name a handful, we have Jacobin, Reclaim the Net, Common Dreams, Code Pink, FAIR, SharePost, In These Times, Mint Press News, Truth Out, and World Socialist website, along with the Substacks and blogs of polemicist journalists with large social media followings, people like Glenn Greenwald, Matt Taibbi, and Caitlin Johnstone. This second group of sources provides editorialized information that Russell takes wholesale and rebroadcasts to substantiate the main arguments and opinions that you'll hear on his channel. And this is something we'll go into more detail on shortly. Now, Russell makes a lot of noise about the importance of accurately sourcing information.
We check our sources, we never say anything that can't be backed up. Our sources, which we link to in the description. This is not conspiracy, we'll show you all the data, we show our working up, we show our sources.
It'd therefore probably come as a surprise to viewers to learn that there is never any guarantee that the publication Russell is showing you on screen is the actual source of the information he's giving you. In this video, Russell sources a statistic about members of the US House of Representatives and tells his audience is from a Guardian article written by Robert Reich. But if you go to that article in The Guardian, you will not find the statistic mentioned anywhere, because it's actually from an entirely different publication, written by an entirely separate author. In another video, Russell sources a quote about the civil war in Yemen, apparently from an article in Jacobin. But it's not from Jacobin, it's from FAIR. I watched a comparatively small fragment of the videos on Russell's channel, but this kept coming up. And it was strange to me that that the referencing would be wrong so much of the time, given the extent to which Russell leans on these sources to bolster his credibility, often saying, "Don't take my word for it, I'm just the guy from Forgetting Sarah Marshall. These are the words of this other, more reliable person I'm quoting from."
So in the words of that person, who I assume is some sort of medical expert, that's not me, that's that person. That's not my word, that's a study. Not my counter-arguments, the bloke that was in Forgetting Sarah Marshall, some bloke from Forgetting Sarah Marshall, Forgetting Sarah Marshall, Sarah Marshall, Sarah Marshall.
Aren't you the horse from horsing around?
However, the bigger realization I came to pretty quickly was that the way Russell credulously regurgitates information given to him by other people was not at all indicative of someone with the skeptical outlook that Russell claimed to have. Take the video, "Ukraine War is a Resource War." In this video, Russell Brand extensively quotes from an opinion piece by Greg Coleridge in the online publication Common Dreams. Now, if you have even a passing familiarity with Greg's article, you'll notice that Russell's personal contributions to the topic, outside of the arguments already made by Greg, are extremely limited. Where Greg's article says, "Russia wants to control resources, so do Western nations," Russell follows up by repeating that exact same argument, but with a phraseology that lends itself to the interpretation he might have thought it up himself.
Russia's invasion is likely in part motivated by a desire to control those resources, and possibly, and forgive me if this sounds cynical, the Western response could in part be motivated by some of those resources.
Yeah, I know, we read the same article. Russell also contributes an abundance of rhetorical questions directed at the audience which hammer home Greg's points in a more combative way. So when Greg says that corporations directly benefit from war, Russell muses,
"When a system benefits from war, might the system be biased in favour of war? Do you think that a system that benefits from war might, on some level, be pro-war?"
When Greg says that Raytheon and Lockheed Martin are telling investors that war is good for business, Russell says,
"The money ends up with Lockheed Martin, Raytheon. Do you see a theme developing? Where's the money go? Where does it go again? Raytheon, Lockheed Martin. Are you seeing a theme developing yet?"
When Greg says that diplomacy isn't profitable, Russell says,
"But the fact that it's not profitable and other outcomes are profitable might be a factor in the results that we're given."
By the time Russell's done, the guy has quoted almost every paragraph of Greg's text from top to bottom. And a major consequence of this is that Russell's arguments aren't really Russell's arguments. They're Greg's arguments. They're just coming out of Russell's mouth. There is no world in which letting someone else decide all of your arguments for you is going to be conducive to independent thinking. Nothing that Greg says gets challenged, and Russell doesn't disagree with or debate any of Greg's points. Instead, Russell blindly and immediately accepts the narrative Greg wants to spoon-feed him.
Just blindly and immediately accepting the narrative that you're spoon-fed no longer seems prudent.
Russell's not a skeptical person. He's just gullible to alternative strands of dogma. Russell actually allows all his Type 2 sources to put their spoons in his mouth and feed him whatever they want, because he sees them as inherently trustworthy independent voices, not beholden to moneyed interests.
That's why we need independent voices like this, and independent conversations like this one. An independent media, a media that is not beholden to sponsors.
So, is Greg Coleridge just an independent guy who has some opinions? Interestingly, no. Greg Coleridge was the director of an NGO called the American Friends Service Committee for over 30 years, which was funded by George Soros' Open Society Foundation.
George Soros has weaponized his vast wealth in support of US foreign policy for several decades.
Also, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund.
The Rockefeller Foundation, which is the precursor to Bill Gates, he learned his game from them.
And also the British government.
Propping up the narrative that the government wants conveyed.
As it happens, these are all moneyed interests who Russell perceives as powerful vectors of what he calls a globalist corporatist agenda. One of the main narratives Russell advances on his channel is that globalist power brokers like George Soros pay lots of money to organizations in order to perniciously influence people's thoughts and opinions.
What we're talking about here is power. Power. George Soros doesn't donate $128.5 million to the Democrat Party for no reason at all. He does it for a reason. What is the reason? Is the reason to assert control?
Bizarre as it may seem, given Russell's deep concern about George Soros furthering his agenda by donating to organizations, Greg Coleridge is not the only journalist from a Soros-funded organization whose opinions Russell has regurgitated to his audience. In the video, Stand With Ukraine, really? Russell shared substantial portions of an article written by Heidi Chow for Jacobin. Heidi is the executive director of Jubilee Debt Campaign, who lists George Soros' Open Society Foundation as one of the key investors supporting their work. In the video, we're not allowed to talk about this, Russell was happy to point his audience to an article in Truth Out by Lindsay Koshgarian. Lindsay is the director of the National Priorities Project, who also received grants and funding from George Soros' Open Society Foundation. In the video, Did Elon Just Expose This?, Russell championed an article published in Responsible Statecraft, which is a publication owned by the Quincy Institute, whose main donors are Charles Koch and George Soros. In the video, So, Trump is right! Russell shared a study with his audience, which was commissioned by the Center for International Policy. They have received multiple donations worth hundreds of thousands of dollars from George Soros' Open Society Foundation. There's a few observations I want to draw from this knowledge we've just gained. The first one is that there's not really any such thing as independent media or independent voices in the way Russell tends to conceptualize them. The word independent is, of course, useful as a shorthand way of separating outlets like Common Dreams from the legacy media. But journalists who write for internet blogs and niche publications are usually still getting funding from somewhere. But there's something even more interesting in all this. The fact that Russell Brand, an avowed opponent of centralist, globalist, corporatist interests, landed on articles authored by people from Soros-funded organizations and thought of those people as upstanding, independent, anti-establishment voices really flies in the face of the idea that globalist billionaires like George Soros are asserting total agenda-driven control over the people and organizations they give money to. Instead, it speaks to the idea that Soros gives financial backing to causes he agrees with, but people within those causes have diverging opinions and write whatever they want. I mean, the only alternative explanation would be that Russell is correct about George Soros and other Great Reset advocates funneling money to agencies and journalists explicitly to further one doctrinarian corporatist agenda, which would make Russell their little flamboyant performing monkey who amplifies that agenda to an unwitting audience. You know, if you're a fan of Russell and you're completely bought in on this Great Reset agenda spreading theory, you just have to pick your poison on this one. Now, going back to Russell's Ukraine war is a resource war video. At this point, people might say, sure, Russell uncritically repeated all of Greg Coleridge's points. And sure, Russell was oblivious to Greg's background of being funded by someone who Russell suspects of advancing an evil globalist agenda. But it was all good information in Greg's article. There's nothing Russell said that was untrue.
We check our sources. We never say anything that can't be backed up.
With this in mind, let's walk through some of the claims made in Greg's article.
US military contractors Raytheon and Lockheed Martin are telling their investors the tensions are good for business.
So, first of all, we have some exceptionally dishonest framing. When Greg says that these military companies were telling investors about the Ukraine tensions being good for business, what he means is they held their public quarterly earnings calls at the end of 2021, as would be expected of any publicly traded company, and on those earnings calls, these weapons manufacturers discussed their earnings. Despite Greg associating their remarks with the war in Ukraine, neither Raytheon nor Lockheed Martin ever even mentioned Ukraine. These calls happened 1 month before there was any Ukraine war to speak about, because Russia hadn't invaded yet. In the call transcripts, you can see that they do talk about a list of world regions which are identified as places of high tension. These are United Arab Emirates, Eastern Europe, the South China Sea, the Middle East, the Asia Pacific region, North Korea, Iran, Yemen, Russia, China. There is nothing about a hypothetical invasion of Ukraine being good for business. But that is the exact way Greg is selling it to his readers. There's also a straight up lie in this passage. We're told that General Dynamics boasted that disputes like Ukraine have expanded their bottom line,
while General Dynamics Corporations boasts that past such disputes have expanded their bottom line.
Here's the transcript of the only part of the General Dynamics earnings call where they talk about Ukraine. Listen out for anything which sounds like boasting, which references past such disputes, or which references General Dynamics' bottom line. They are asked,
right? I mean, the Ukraine and what has been going on with Russia has been in the headlines. What does that mean for your international land systems business, particularly in Eastern Europe?
And General Dynamics reply,
well, for some time now, the Eastern European demand for combat vehicles has been at an elevated level. But I have to tell you that
speculation about the considerable tension in Eastern Europe and any subsequent impact on budgets is just ill-advised given the high threat environment. So we are hopeful for a peaceful resolution, but that is a national security issue for the U.S. and its allies.
There are no words in here that could be interpreted by any rational person as boasting. There is nothing in here about past disputes similar to Ukraine. There is nothing in here about General Dynamics expanding their bottom line. General Dynamics offer no comment on anything like that. They say it's not for them to comment and that they're hopeful for a peaceful resolution. I happen to know where Greg got this claim from. It comes from this article in the publication In These Times, which was published 1.5 months before Greg's came out. It's where Greg also got his information about Lockheed Martin and Raytheon. The publication In These Times used the same words that Greg would go on to paraphrase. General Dynamics is boasting, past returns, such disputes, and they provide excerpts of the exact same call I showed you, which we now know contains no sign of boasting, or returns, or similar past disputes. None of that is in here. And of course, Russell Brand is even more oblivious, even further down the excremental pipeline, drinking Greg's BS through a curly-whirly straw.
Boasts that past such disputes have expanded their bottom line. Can you go one day without hearing about those guys and their skullduggery?
Once something has made its way into his hand written on a piece of paper, he's believing that as factual truth, no questions asked. Greg's article also contains this rather conspicuously outrageous statistic.
Past and current military spending equals 48% of all spent federal tax dollars. Does that mean nearly half of all of your taxes is military expenditure?
Wow, half of all my taxes goes to the military. That's surprisingly high. Almost unbelievably high. The source of Greg's claim is this pie chart infographic, which was produced by an organization called War Resisters International. I knew immediately from looking at it that something weird was going on. When you look up military spending as a proportion of the total US budget in other places, Wikipedia says 16%. The Congressional Budget Office says a sixth, which would be 16 to 17%. The Center on Budget and Policy Priorities says 13%. The Peter G. Peterson Foundation says 12%. So it's not like we have a mutually agreed figure, but those percentages are all very close to each other. Greg's pie chart had managed to arrive at a figure that was 3 times the size of the largest estimate from any other source. And so I simply could not rest until I'd worked out how they'd done this. The infographic puts the predicted Department of Defense budget at $743 billion, which is in line with the official budget and other sources. Below that is where we begin to see some tenuous extrapolations. Retiree pay, so ex-military people who get a state pension, according to the graph, that is still military spending. Money going to NASA is military spending. Domestic border patrol agents are military spending. Counterterrorism task forces, cybersecurity teams, the FBI, the Secret Service, all military spending. What becomes clear when you look at all the qualifying information is that the creators of this pie chart have taken such a broad view of military spending that anything that is even tangentially related to defending American security interests is categorized as a military expense. And so what should be $743 billion just turns into $965 billion. But it's about to get even stranger as we journey over to the left-hand side of the pie chart, which is about past military spending. Here, we are asked to imagine a world in which America had never owned a military at any point in the past, and how much money would America be saving now if it had never owned a military at any point in the past? So, immediately, you can see that veterans' benefits is now considered military expenditure. Because if America had never owned a military, there'd be no veterans to have to give benefits to. So if there's some old man who lives on your street and he gets a check from the government, in the eyes of the people who made this pie chart, that is military spending. No different than paying for a tank to shoot an old man in the head. Even more brazenly, $476 billion have been added for the interest on the national debt, under the extraordinary leap of logic that if America had never ever had a military, it would now have no debts. So that's how War Resisters International magically turned $743 billion into $1.7 trillion. But you know what? That's still only around 30% of the budget. So how'd they bring it up to half? It was right at the end of reviewing this chart that I noticed they had pegged the total outlays for 2022 at $3.5 trillion, when the official figure was actually $5 trillion. And here's the cheat code they used. The budget is made up of two separate funds. Federal funds, paid for by income taxes, and trust funds, paid for by payroll taxes. What War Resistance International did was to completely remove trust funds and payroll taxes from this equation, thus making the overall amount of money the US spends look smaller, which means that War Resistance International can make the already overinflated military budget seem like an even bigger proportion of the now diminished total. I had to marvel at this, because it was all completely ridiculous, and quite frankly, an outright lie to say that 48% of people's taxes go to the military. And yet the organisation who produced this graphic went to extraordinary effort of including all these little caveats and rationalizations on the sidelines to avoid being accused of outright fabrication. And yet we all know that this pie chart is intended to deceive the average unwitting person, who is not going to look past the 48% figure. As it happens, this is not a hypothetical concern, because we already know exactly the kind of person who would get taken in by this tacky misinformation.
Does that mean nearly half of all of your taxes is military expenditure?
You know what? I blame George Soros for this. Russell springboards from the stupid claim about taxes to say that all military money actually goes into the pockets of private companies Lockheed Martin and Raytheon.
A significant amount of this military spending is not going into the pockets of soldiers and men and women that are fighting wars and to make sure they've got good kit or, heaven forbid, good care after they've been in combat. The money ends up with Lockheed Martin, Raytheon.
Now, we know that in 2022, the US Department of Defense spent $44.5 billion on Lockheed Martin and $25.4 billion on Raytheon. It's a lot of money, but not when you look at the overall amount of military spending they did that year, which according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute was $877 billion. This was the final amount they ended up spending overall, which is different to the initial amount they forecasted in the budget at the start of the year. When you calculate the amount of money spent on Lockheed Martin and Raytheon as a proportion, it's 8% of the total.
A significant amount of this military spending.
Stop. Would we call that a significant amount? Like, if I said I was going to split the profits of my lemonade stand with you, right, and then I turned around and gave you 8% of the money, you would feel like you had received a significant amount?
It's not going into the pockets of soldiers and men and women that are fighting wars and to make sure they've got good kit.
The amount spent on military personnel was $167 billion, which was more than double the amount spent on Lockheed Martin and Raytheon combined. In terms of making sure the army had good kit, which from Russell's gesture, I don't know what kit that is. Is that the hat of a Victorian chimney sweep? As if soldiers, men and women on the front lines are going to be like, yeah, enough with the precision rocket launchers from Lockheed Martin, okay? And the enemy detecting radar systems from Raytheon. We don't want those. You're not giving us enough hats. As far as I can see, kit would come under operation and maintenance costs, supplies, materials, and equipment. The US military spent $307 billion on that, which is over 4 times the amount that was spent on Lockheed Martin and Raytheon.
Or, heaven forbid, good care after they've been in combat. That's when it's okay to cast them out into the streets and to leave them littering your cities and towns.
So, first of all, just to acknowledge that 30 seconds prior to this, Russell was leveraging a source which framed veteran spending as an inherently negative societal military tax burden to benefit his narrative, and now he's outflanking his own argument from the left to say that society doesn't actually do enough spending on veterans. So we're going all over the place here, but to pin this back down, we can see the amount spent on benefits and services for veterans in the full 2022 budget breakdown. In mandatory programs, the US government allocated $161 billion for benefits and services for veterans. In tax expenditures, $12 billion was allocated for veterans' death benefits, disability compensation, veterans' pensions, GI Bill benefits and housing benefits. In federal research and development spending, $1.5 billion was allocated for the Veterans Affairs Agency. And then under grand and direct federal programs, we have a combined total of $9.6 billion allocated for veterans' hospitals and medical care, and $12 billion allocated for veterans' education, training, and rehabilitation. All told, we're looking at $196 billion being spent on veterans, which is around 2.5 times the amount going to Lockheed Martin and Raytheon.
No, the money ends up with Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, public money, your taxes, you at work doing your job. Where does it go again?
Personnel, operation and maintenance, veterans benefits, Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security.
Are you seeing a theme developing yet?
Yep, a theme of you having no clue where people's taxes go. Although admittedly, your picture of everything is going to be very skewed if you've been led to believe that half of all taxes go to 2 private military companies. What we've just seen, with Russell leaning on a series of tenuous claims made by Greg Coleridge, is a persistent theme across all of Russell's videos, which is to say, out-of-pocket claims being made by a ragtag ensemble of pundits, and Russell credulously reading them off pieces of paper, believing every word that enters his eyes. In this video, Russell reads a blog by Caitlin Johnstone that says Western leaders are swapping out the term international law with the alternative phrase rules-based international order. And they're doing this because they don't want to draw people's attention to the fact that they themselves regularly break international law.
That's why in the lead up to this confrontation with Russia, we saw a push among empire managers to swap out the term international law with rules-based international order. If we say international law, people may point out that we ourselves regularly break international law. Call it something else, something made up and a bit shit and bureaucratic and difficult to understand and dissect. How about rules-based international order? Yeah, that's pretty vague.
And Russell looks pretty pleased with himself here, feeling like by virtue of reading hidden knowledge on this internet blog, he's cracked the case of the Great Western word-switching scandal. Empire leaders thought they could deflect attention away from their war crimes by not saying the phrase international law. But they didn't bank on Russell Brand with his insatiable curiosity and genius humour, if this is your kind of comedy. Putting it all together, here are some excerpts of speeches given by world leaders around the same time that Russell released this video. We have US President Joe Biden,
International law.
US Representative to the United Nations Linda Thomas-Greenfield,
International law.
UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres,
International law.
French Prime Minister Emmanuel Macron,
International law.
German Ambassador to the UN Antje Lindetze,
International law.
Norwegian Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Store,
International law.
UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson,
International law.
Irish Defence Minister Simon Coveney,
International law.
the Mexican representative at the UN, whose name didn't flash on screen, so I don't know what it is, sorry.
It's international law.
Indian Foreign Minister Subramanyam Jaishankar.
International law.
It really doesn't feel like they've swapped out the phrase international law. Seems like they're all still saying it. A lot. And this is exactly the kind of claim that if Russell was the skeptical person he claimed to be, he would investigate.
We want to interrogate and investigate the facts so that we can bring you truth.
Because on its face, it's pretty unbelievable. If you're a world leader involved in consulting on and ratifying international laws, you're probably going to use the phrase international law pretty often, right? It'd be one of the most out-of-pocket schemes imaginable if politicians stopped using that word in public as a Jedi mind trick to get away with war crimes. But Russell doesn't do investigating. He just believes what he reads.
If we say international law, people may point out that we ourselves regularly break international law.
You can find references to the phrase rules-based international order in academic publications dating as far back as the early 90s, so it can hardly be called some new concept invented by the West in response to a confrontation with Russia happening in 2022. Rules-based international order is an umbrella term for the international system of laws, rules, and norms that underpin relations between different sovereign states. It has not replaced and will never replace the concept of international law, which still exists on its own terms. Rules-based international order merely describes a bigger category of conventions that work alongside international law to bind global nation-states together. As it happens, the journalist who Russell Brand is getting his information from, Caitlin Johnstone, was not actually the first person to put forward this argument about Western powers switching words around. This international law word-switching claim was first made back in 2019 by Sergei Lavrov, the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs. This is an excerpt from the official translation taken from a news conference Sergei Lavrov did in Moscow. There have been attempts to steamroll multilateral institutions and erode their international mission and to replace the universal norms of international law with a rules-based order.
We're not talking about international law. This is a rules-based international order.
This term was recently coined to camouflage as striving to invent rules depending on changes in the political situation so as to be able to put pressure on disagreeable states and often even on allies. Sergei Lavrov, of course, had every reason to undermine the concept of a rules-based international order and international law, given Russia's imperialistic territorial ambitions, which they would set in motion not too far down the line from this conference. So, again, we're seeing claims with no factual basis being made by propagandists and then passed down an agenda-spreading production line with not a single person checking the source or the claim's validity. Not only is Russell repeating something which is factually delusional, his naivety leaves him susceptible to the propaganda of nation-states he doesn't even live in. In the video, Stand with Ukraine? Really? Russell tells his audience that after the 2014 Russia invasion of Crimea, the International Monetary Fund forced Ukraine to make punishing cuts to public spending.
IMF loans came with strings attached, which pushed Ukraine to accept punishing conditions involving public spending cuts, privatisation and market liberalisation. That's not going to help stabilise Ukraine, is it?
Notice that there's no data given for this claim, and absolutely no way for any viewer to discern how Russell worked this out.
This is not conspiracy. We'll show you all the data. We show our working up. We show our sources.
No, you don't. You give us a sentence on a page written by some blogger, and that's your evidence. The article he's reading from, whose author is funded by George Soros, also gives no sources. I extracted year-on-year public spending figures in Ukraine from periodic reports. Here's a graph showing what I found. Ukraine had an IMF loan plan in place from 2008, which was ultimately frozen in 2011. And the next loan that Ukraine accepted from the IMF came in February 2015 after the Russians invaded and occupied Crimea. So, Russell's narrative is that during these periods of time, the IMF was forcing Ukraine to make punishing cuts to public spending. The data does not support that claim in any way, shape, or form. Ukraine's public spending patterns outside of IMF loan conditions appear to be extremely similar to what they spend when there's an IMF loan in place. In actual fact, the only material public spending cut appears to have happened between 2013 and 2014 outside of IMF loan conditions, when Russia was choking the supply of natural gas to Ukraine and starting a trade war with them. The part of the graph that makes Russell's claim seem even more in contrast with reality is that the IMF loan period between 2016 and 2019 appears to show the most precipitous growth in Ukraine's public spending of the last 20 years.
That's not going to help stabilise Ukraine, is it?
Again, Russell speaks so confidently and smugly about a situation he knows nothing about, whilst having no facts or data to stand on. The only thing he has, and this is what he happily uses, is the word of a George Soros-funded journalist.
George Soros, that's what's needed here. He'll get the truth out there. We can relax.
Yes, that is you. Unironically, that is demonstrably how you operate. You distrust George Soros performatively as a way of virtue signaling to your audience, but if we were to just give Soros a pen name and print his words in Jacobin, you would worship him as the most independent-minded, awakeningest guy ever. In that same Stand with Ukraine video, Russell accuses the International Monetary Fund of instigating wars and coups in Yemen and Bolivia.
The civil war in Yemen and the coup in Bolivia both followed a rejection of IMF terms. Right, so the IMF offered terms to Yemen. Yemen goes, oh, I don't fancy those terms. Okay, well, good luck in the next few years. What did you say as you were leaving? Nothing. Just good luck in the next few years. And Bolivia, a coup.
So Russell's narrative is that the Yemeni government rejected IMF loan terms, and then, as revenge, the IMF instigated a civil war in Yemen. Most sources agree the Yemen civil war started in September 2014 when Houthi forces invaded the capital city of Sana'a. I had a look to see whether the Yemeni government had rejected IMF loan terms beforehand, and Russell's explanation of events fell down at the very first hurdle, because I found that Yemen had, in fact, not rejected, but accepted an IMF loan 3 weeks before the war started on the 2nd of September 2014. The Yemeni government was still committed to pursuing that IMF loan plan 3 months into the war in December 2014, shown by this quote from the Yemeni bank's central governor, Mohammed bin Humam. The IMF loan was only cancelled a year later, not by Yemen, but by the IMF themselves in March 2016, because the IMF lost their ability to perform audits in the midst of the civil war. When you look at the actual timeline of events, it completely contradicts Russell's narrative. The last thing the IMF would ever want in a country it's lending money to is for a civil war to break out, because that would instantly guarantee they're not getting their money back. The claim that the IMF instigated this civil war as revenge for Yemen rejecting their loan terms, something which didn't even happen, was, unsurprisingly, another barefaced lie told on an internet blog, which Russell instantly believed with zero evidence provided to back it up.
And Bolivia, a coup.
What about Bolivia? Bolivia did reject IMF loan terms in 2005. And then, absolutely nothing happened for 14 years. A period in which Bolivian leader Evo Morales nationalized the Bolivian oil and gas sector, signed a military cooperation agreement with Venezuela, approved the new Bolivian constitution, got elected to a second term in 2009, decentralized political power, seized control of Bolivia's electric grid, presided over the largest period of economic growth in Bolivia's history, got elected to a third term in 2014, and as these 14 years pass by, the Bolivian public loves him, and the Western liberal media loves him, and he got endorsed by the Pope. And according to Russell, the the IMF is just sitting there this whole time, watching it and letting it all happen. And then in 2019, after changing the rules to allow himself to run for a 4th term, Morales declared outright victory in an election where the results were disputed by an America-aligned organization who called for a runoff vote. Morales refused, leading to widespread unrest fueled by the opposition party, and eventually Morales lost the support of his own military and resigned. Morales retrospectively pointed to this messy chain of events and called it an internationally backed right-wing coup. Putting aside the reductionism of the logic that any thumb placed on the scale of an election by a non-profit must be a coup, there is an extraordinary amount of time between Morales rejecting IMF loan terms in 2005 and Morales being forced to step down in 2019. According to Russell's theory, the IMF sat back and did nothing while Morales implemented all of his most radical anti-American left-wing policies, and then chose to coup him 3 presidential terms later via the most convoluted chain of events imaginable. It doesn't pass the smell test for me.
And Bolivia, a coup.
It's an IMF coup. Look, he says it on this piece of paper I'm holding. And let's be crystal clear. That is literally Russell's epistemological approach.
We check our sources, we never say anything that can't be backed up.
Checking whether claims can be backed up is actually a deceptively complex process. It involves tracking claims back to the original person who made them, reviewing their information sources, establishing surrounding context, then, with all that knowledge you've gathered, deciding whether the claim is tenable, not forgetting to check whether there are any hard facts elsewhere that completely contradict it. Russell Brand doesn't do any of this stuff. If he did, he would quickly run out of things to say. He said that General Dynamics were boasting that conflicts like Ukraine had expanded their bottom line. That was completely made up. He said that half of all American taxes go to the military. That was bullshit. He said that tax money doesn't go to veterans. Patently false. He said that leaders were replacing the phrase international law with the alternative phrase rules-based international order. That was a lie. He said the IMF forced Ukraine to make public spending cuts. Another lie. He said the IMF fomented a civil war in Yemen as revenge for rejecting their loan terms. Never happened. If you remember, on the way into this video, Russell told his audience that the mainstream media was engaging in a mass brainwashing campaign in the beginning of 2022 by censoring the topic of peace discussions. Now, for anyone else, that would be a massive claim, a finding of gargantuan proportions which one could only justifiably arrive at after hours of watching and dissecting mainstream media. But Russell arrives at that conclusion after reading one line of a Matt Taibbi blog.
This is by Matt Taibbi.
You see, Russell isn't actually watching any mainstream news himself.
I don't watch mainstream news, it's not good for you.
So he's a defiant mainstream media critic who refuses to ever engage with mainstream news, in the same way that he's a detractor of the American taxation system who refuses to understand tax budgets. An international politics observer who doesn't bother to follow what's being said in the UN General Assembly. Russell's whole world is confined to what he is told by these dozen or so anti-establishment blogs. And just like a film critic who doesn't watch films, or a football commentator who doesn't turn up to football matches, or a restaurant reviewer who refuses to step foot in any restaurant, Russell's viewpoints on these topics are compelling only when you share his level of oblivious separation from the actual things he's criticizing. The commercial line for the Russell Brand YouTube channel is that Russell and his team are interrogating and investigating facts to bring you truth. But what actually happens on Russell's channel is that Russell's writers pass in blogs and clips.
Right now, we need a writer, researcher, who is very good at finding clips.
Russell then, armed with the blogs and clips that have been passed along to him, looks to see if they align with his politics, checks if there is a journalist's name attached so he can put their name on the screen and say it's their words, not his.
That's not me, that's that person.
And this is what interrogating and investigating facts functionally means on Russell's channel. Copying and pasting unsourced claims from internet blogs and proclaiming them as secret facts that the establishment doesn't want you to know about, even if deep state actors are funding the people who are supposedly spilling these facts to Russell. The real crux of the issue with the intrepid values Russell lays claim to, but early fails to embody, is that he seems to think skepticism is an innate quality of being, which he has achieved by distrusting the political establishment and refusing to watch mainstream media, when in reality, being skeptical is a muscle you have to exercise on a day-to-day basis, showing restraint in the face of dubious claims that align with your own worldview. If all your skepticism amounts to is, I don't believe what the government and mainstream media tells me.
If you agree with what the government is telling you and the media is telling you, have a little think first.
If all your skepticism is pointed in one direction, That's not skepticism. You are like a child who drinks the colourful bottles of chemicals under the sink just because his parents once lied to him about the tooth fairy, so everything else they've ever said must have been a lie. This word skeptical does not in any way describe Russell Brand, but there are several other adjectives that do. Overly trusting, impressionable, naive, gullible, easily manipulated. We've spent a lot of time in this video analysing specific, discrete, untrue claims, and I think there is value in that, particularly for showing how easy it is to be misled when we prima facie designate a handful of news outlets and people as the independent and trustworthy ones, and therefore believe every stupid claim they write down. But when it comes to the kinds of videos Russell makes, focusing on his pernickety porcupines risks missing the forest for the trees. The individual lies that Russell tells his viewers are not actually all that consequential in and of themselves. Who honestly cares if Russell tells his viewers that arsenic contamination comes from the baby food packaging factory when it actually comes from the soil? Who cares if Russell tells his viewers 48% of their taxes go to the military when the real figure is over 3 times smaller? In a vacuum, these misstatements of fact are completely innocuous. However, Russell's viewers are not flocking to his channel to hear a disconnected series of statements apropos of nothing. The main draw of Russell's commentary is dense, world-building narratives that weave politics, economics, and culture into a Manichaean web where the powers of evil are relentlessly entangling, entrapping, and subjugating the powerless. Although Russell may not be the architect of the information he reads, he very effectively weaponizes each and every falsehood he comes across to prop up a hostile, feverishly paranoid worldview that is all of his own making. When Russell made his video about arsenic contamination in rice, he didn't just get some of the facts wrong, he leveraged those misinformed points of ignorance as a foundation to baselessly speculate that a secret plot was underway to intentionally make Americans sick and unhealthy. When Russell falsely claimed the mainstream media was censoring the concept of peace talks from their news reporting, that wasn't just one random out-of-pocket claim. It was a convenient distortion of reality to prop up Russell's grand narrative that the public were being brainwashed by elitist powers. When Russell mischaracterized the conversations of American weapons manufacturers, it lent credibility to his overarching argument that the invasion of Ukraine was in fact a Western-backed profit-making scheme. The articles Russell reads are not just falling into his lap by chance, tumbling out of the ether. These are exhibits of incredibly biased hack journalism with a low threshold for factual rigor, which Russell exploits to advance his own ideological worldview. And Russell is not opposed to misrepresenting information himself when he can't find the right articles to spin. In the video, they want war and they're not Russian. Russell tells his audience that cable news viewership has jumped massively since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and that this shows that the mainstream media have a financial incentive to push America towards war.
You can't just say the mainstream media are pushing for war because they profit from it without any proof, or it's a conspiracy theory. Proof! Cable news viewership has jumped during Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Oh, what a coincidence. CNN, Fox and MSNBC collectively averaged 6.4 million viewers in prime time. That's up from their January average of 4 million. CNN's audience soared from 633,000 in January to 1.75 million last week, up 178%. And MSNBC had 980,000 for its war coverage, up 51% over January.
There's a very specific impression you get coming away from this video, which is that mainstream media's views are going up like this. Ukraine gets invaded, and legacy media outlets instantly secure themselves a continual supply of viewers, which translates to higher advertising revenue, sponsors, etc. A 178% increase is no joke. Russell's statistics and numbers are confirmed by an Associated Press article, wrongly quoted in Russell's video as being from ABC News. To get a better idea of what the viewership trends on these networks actually looked like, I went to the TV Newser website, which keeps a tally of all the viewing figures on the main cable channels day by day. And this is what I saw happening from the 21st of February in the immediate build-up to Russia's full-scale ground invasion of the Donbass. The audiences for both daytime and primetime news shows ascended rapidly, reaching a peak on the 24th of February, which is when Putin officially declared Russia's invasion. We then have numbers decreasing over the weekend, and then viewership explodes during the following week, reaching all-time highs during primetime on the 1st of March. But after that, viewership goes down and down and down. and over the subsequent 3 weeks, it never goes back up to the same heights again. Let me show you these viewing figures with more context, giving you the ratings for the 2 previous months and the subsequent months. There is very clearly a 2-week period where viewership is way higher than it would usually be, but once that 2-week bump was over, the mainstream media were getting the same kinds of views that they were getting prior to the invasion of Ukraine. Going back to the article Russell used in his video, I was able to interpret his statistics with a fresh pair of eyes. CNN's audience was boosted by 178% for just a few days, with most of that bump coming from a single massive spike on an idle Tuesday evening. And from here, I started unraveling the deceptive way that Russell had packaged this. The Associated Press article reporting the surge in mainstream media viewership was published on the 1st of March, right after the main networks hit their biggest numbers, which they would never come anywhere close to again. Russell published his video on the 24th of March, 3 weeks later, when the mainstream media surge in viewership was very much over. However, there is nothing on screen to indicate that Russell is quoting an article that is 3 weeks old. And what's more, Russell deliberately suppresses information that would give the game away. Here's the quote from the AP article. CNN, Fox, and MSNBC collectively averaged 6.4 million viewers in prime time between the start of the war last Wednesday and Sunday night. That's up from their January average of 4 million. So the article's author is very clear that they're talking about a narrow 5-day time window between Wednesday and Sunday night. Now look how Russell chooses to quote that text on screen.
CNN, Fox and MSNBC collectively averaged 6.4 million viewers in prime time. That's up from their January average of 4 million.
An essential part of the quotation, the reference to the time window at the start of the war, is removed. So there's no way for the viewer to know that Russell is giving them stats which are, by this point, a lie. They were only true to describe a narrow 5-day time period 3 weeks earlier. The false picture being painted of continuous super high viewing figures is dishonest by design. Here's a video that Russell released 1 month later on April the 25th.
Let's look at a few additional points about the mainstream media when it comes to the war in Ukraine. Cable news viewership has significantly jumped during Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Okay.
No, it hasn't jumped. Here's what mainstream media viewership looks like at the point where Russell released this video. Not only has cable news viewership not significantly jumped, the average amount of views across the big networks during the week when Russell recorded this video was actually lower than 2 of the weeks from January before the invasion of Ukraine started. And look again at the manipulation of language. The article says jumped, indicating something that happened once and is done, but Russell changes the phrase to has significantly jumped, indicating something which is still ongoing. You might wonder why it's so important for Russell to make his audience believe that the mainstream media are continuously reaping high viewing figures from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It all comes down to the narrative, the story Russell wants to tell. The narrative Russell is pushing is that the mainstream media in America has fueled an unnecessary conflict between 2 independent nations on the other side of the world, resulting in the deaths of tens of thousands of innocent people. The first question that anyone's going to ask when they hear that is, what on earth could the mainstream media hope to achieve? By conjuring up a false picture of continuous sky-high ratings and thus profits, Russell magically gives the mainstream media a much stronger motive for wanting a war to happen. If you look at the actual proof he provides for that claim, the proof is that the mainstream media got high ratings for 5 days in February when Russia first invaded Ukraine. It's a reach and an absolutely absurd application of logic. Here's Russell again in March 2023, 1 year after Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Cable news viewership jumped during Russia's invasion of Ukraine. They drive viewers to their channels through reporting excessively on the war.
They reported excessively on the war. Russell would have been fine with just a little bit of reporting, but these news channels were reporting on it every day, as if they were some sort of 24-hour news business. The fact that a lot of people were watching TV during the largest full-scale invasion of a country on the European continent since World War II is about the least surprising thing ever, but Russell embeds it into a narrative that makes it suspect, makes it seedy. He of all people should know that there isn't anything particularly strange about the MSM's high viewing figures because Russell benefited from exactly the same bump in traffic. Look at this graph charting the views of all Russell's individual videos between February and March 2022. The ones in red were the ones Russell made about the invasion of Ukraine. What do you notice? Well, in the early stages of Russia's breaking invasion, the videos Russell made about the Ukraine war represent his most highly viewed videos over this time period. For Russell, high viewership on YouTube translates very directly to more AdSense money, more sponsorships, and more revenue. In other words, you could very much say that Russell profited from excessively reporting on the war in the very same way he accused the mainstream media of doing, before Russell's views on Ukraine videos went back to normal following the exact same mainstream media trend. Here's another example of Russell reframing information. He tells his viewers about an amusing poll.
Meanwhile, in the United States, despite the media's saber-rattling, there is limited public appetite for any conflict with Russia. A Rasmussen poll found that only 31% of Americans think US troops should be sent to Ukraine. That statistic shows plainly that the mainstream media don't listen to you. 31% of people, yeah, all right, so that means 69% don't want a war. And what's the mainstream media's response? Yeah, come on, let's have a war.
In the poll Russell Brand is citing, 31% of American people are for sending troops to Ukraine, 33% of people are undecided, and 36% of people are against.
So that means 69% don't want a war.
In Russell's narrative, 36% turns into 69%, almost double, because Russell takes all undecideds and arbitrarily names them as people who are against military intervention, a choice they did not make, so he can say that they align with his position. And also, notice how Russell is smuggling in a premise that has nothing to do with what the poll was asking. He says that 69% of people don't want a war, as if 31% said, I would like a war to happen, rather than, if Russia attacks Ukraine, I would want the US to send combat troops. You might be thinking to yourself, wait a minute, when Russell made this video on the 24th of March, 2022, Russia had already attacked Ukraine. There was already a war ongoing. And yes, it's another case of Russell roaming backwards through time to find the best statistics to support his position. Despite publishing this video in March 2022, he quotes a poll from the 26th of January, an entire month before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the article he heard about the poll from dates back to the beginning of February. The author of this article, who Russell has selected as an expert who he and his audience can learn from,
I'm just like you. I'm just trying to work this stuff out.
That author is saying that Russia will not invade Ukraine. Here are some quotes from the article. This is far from the first media panic over a supposedly imminent Russian invasion. There are actually considerably fewer Russian units on Ukraine's border than there were even 11 months ago. This journalist was saying the media was lying about Russia wanting to invade Ukraine, and this guy was even making the argument that Russian troops were withdrawing from the Ukrainian border in January 2022. When Russell read this blog 2 months later, after Russia literally did the thing the media was saying they would do and invaded Ukraine, it should have been abundantly clear to Russell that the journalist who wrote this had zero credibility. But that didn't matter, because the journalist was helping Russell tell the story he wanted to tell. If Russell was to look at up-to-date polling at the time he made his video in March 2022, he would find that 47% of Americans, a majority, approved of the US government's response to Ukraine, versus 39%, a minority, who disapproved. Those statistics obviously needed to be undone so that Russell could make his grandstanding argument that the government operates against the will of the people.
Like every other institution, whether it's apparent democracy or whatever, they don't listen to you.
This very deliberate obfuscation and distortion of information that Russell does is why I do not buy his constructed appearance of naive intellectual sophomoric curiosity.
So we're going to learn from one another. We're on this path together. No one's better than you. No one thinks they're cleverer than you. Certainly I don't. So I really want your comments and your opinions on this information that can be quite complex, but that doesn't mean we can't understand it together. We're smart, ain't we? And we're on a journey together. Well done, you. I'm just like you. I'm just trying to work this stuff out. I'm trying to work out how this is operating.
The way Russell talks, you would think he was an average guy who'd just been teleported off the street onto the set of this YouTube channel and received an assignment to learn about politics as best he could using things placed in front of him, rather than, you know, famous public orator who's been refining his political commentary for over 10 years and is well connected enough to have access to the son of a former US president and regularly interviews prominent American politicians. But no, Russell has no clue about any of that stuff. He's just a little guy on a learning adventure. If Russell and his audience were genuinely on a path of learning together and he respected them, why would he rewrite information before showing it to them? Why would he hide information from them? That's not what somebody does when they're on a learning journey with you. That's what somebody does when they've already decided what information you should have access to and what conclusions you should draw from it. The truth is that Russell does not view his audience as equals. He sees them as people who can't be trusted to arrive at the quote-unquote correct conclusions unless he tampers with the evidence beforehand and then rams all the pre-assembled puzzle pieces down their throats. Related to Russell's professed desire to embark on a learning adventure with his audience, he often claims to want to explore complex information with them.
We look at complex information from a variety of sources, bring them together and see what coalesces. Whether you believe that's right or wrong, that's up for you to determine and decide while picking through this complex information. I'm not making any assertions or arrogating any of this complex information. That's not my job. I just want you to have the information.
And I can totally see why someone in Russell's audience might feel that what they're getting is complex. Russell and his journalist friends fire off a lot of historical references, foreign names, statistics, appeals to authority.
A legit academic, the prize-winning journalist, a proper scientist.
And because of the way that Russell machine guns his way through these details with confidence and momentum, it creates the paradoxical illusion of a complex situation, but one where the morally justifiable position is extremely simple and all of the facts are on Russell's side. Indeed, one of Russell's favourite techniques when dealing with interlocutors is reeling off a list of facts for them to refute on the spot.
I'm just listing some facts. An incredibly diverse set of facts. Bill, can I give you a bunch of facts? Because because I'd love to see your take on these facts that come from our content on our show, gleaned from some great journalists.
But I should be clear by this point, Russell's narratives are not fact-driven. It wasn't facts that led Russell to narrativize that the mainstream media gained a continual source of sky-high revenue from the invasion of Ukraine, or that the US population were against providing aid. Russell had to warp and distort the facts to justify telling those narratives, because reality didn't comport with the paranoid view Russell desperately wanted to impose upon his audience. Additionally, the information Russell gives his viewers never ends up being complex in the end, because his narratives have a profound decomplexifying effect. He takes something as complex as American regulatory policy and makes it as simple as big food poisoning your baby to make more money. And he takes another complex issue, like how a nation chooses to fund and structure its military and to what extent those structures incentivize hawkish war policies. This is a topic where there are lots of complex questions we could ask. Are countries with highly privatized defense sectors more inclined to start wars? Countries like America, Germany, and the UK, or are countries with a high degree of state ownership in military companies like Russia, the United Arab Emirates, and China equally as likely to engage in war? But you already know that discussion is too complex to be on Russell's channel. Russell sidesteps all of that complexity so that he can virtue signal private companies want war so they can get more money. This is not complex information. These are not complex perspectives. These are grossly oversimplified narratives for an undiscerning, lowbrow audience. It's politics for children, with repetitive and simple messages, evil villains who make all the bad things happen, and constant reassurances that you are a good little awakening wonder for tuning in. The fact of the matter is that Russell Brand has an agenda. He is committed to the furtherance of this agenda by any means necessary, regardless of what the facts say. And before we close this video out, it's definitely worth probing into what that agenda is. Despite the fact that Russell's commentary is always political in nature, when he talks about his own political beliefs and where they fall on a left to right spectrum, he is often deliberately vague or evasive.
I don't have a dog in the fight. I'm not in America. I don't vote in American elections. If criticizing political figures is right-wing, then I'm right-wing. I'm way, 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 way to the left of any government party anywhere in the world, actually, because I believe in spirituality. If you don't need to be told whether I'm right-wing or left-wing, watch the videos.
However, there is a specific political cause Russell often verbally signals towards, and that political cause is anarchism.
Don't be scared of the word anarchism. It just means a world where people regulate themselves and vote for what they want instead of there being centralized authority. Anarchism, which is simply, really, democracy, autonomy, and self-rule by people for the people without centralized systems of power continually dominating us. Anarchism doesn't mean chaos, it means centralized power is abolished and democracy is practiced at every level of decision making.
Anarchism is a political philosophy that seeks to abolish all institutions and systems that impose power hierarchies on society, such as nation-states, governments, and economic systems like capitalism. In their place, anarchism sets forth a system where people govern themselves in small communities, which they build with fellow travelers who share their own values and belief systems. When you're listening out for these ideas of abolishing the state and people governing themselves in Russell's monologues, you'll find that they permeate a lot of his arguments.
I don't believe in the moral legitimacy of the state at all.
Who benefits from having one centralised government? Why are we not having libertarian, anarcho-syndicalist systems of government where communities are made as small as possible, not as large as possible? The point of government is to transfer public money, that's your money, into private corporate hands. That's what the government is. The government is about power, control. That's what the word government means. Heaven forbid unity, solidarity, people coming together to take control of their own communities, to take control of their own money, to take control of their own businesses, their own lives. Heaven forbid that should happen.
The fact that Russell would lean towards anarchism as a political philosophy actually makes a lot of sense, primarily because of a starry-eyed utopian view of society he preaches, according to which all humans have a natural tendency towards compassion, reason, and unity.
You're not like, I don't like you, you're probably gay, are you? I don't know, what colour are you? You know, that's not what's going on in your mind, is it? That's what's going on in this sort of hive mind that's been externally imposed, separated from one another, bludgeoned from our compassion, separated from our natural reason, our natural tendency towards unity.
The adamant belief that humans have a natural tendency towards unity and using logic and reason leads to severe cognitive dissonance when you look at humans going about their day-to-day lives and see they're not actually exhibiting any of these qualities they're supposed to have. So Russell needs another intellectual theory to plug the gap and explain why the world isn't comporting to his original thesis. Russell therefore attributes moral and rational failings of humans to malicious external power structures, which are controlling populations, perverting our natural impulses, turning us against each other, and manipulating outcomes.
More centralised power, greater ability to control a population. They're trying to turn us against one another continually. Centralised power, the ability to control resources and manipulate outcomes.
It follows that centralised power structures that govern us, like states, governments, and corporations, are not just fallible and self-serving entities, they are an actively hostile threat to human society that want to bring about the downfall of man. They are not indifferent to us, they are at war with us, and the bigger we let them become, the more they will disempower us, further entrenching and centralizing more power for themselves.
Is being used to further entrench and centralize power and to usher in legislation and systems of governance that are not beneficial to ordinary people. They're telling you that you need to give up your power and allow power to be continually centralized. The more power the state has, the more power big business has, the more power Silicon Valley has, the less power you and I will ultimately have.
These are the fiercely rigid doctrines that dictate Russell's whole worldview. Humans are naturally predisposed towards compassion, reason, and unity. Those natural qualities are perverted by centralized power structures, and this results in a tyrannical determinism where the more centralized things become, the more acts of evil, deceit, and manipulation the people in charge will perpetuate. This deterministic narrative drives all of Russell's thought processes and opinions. As we've seen in this video, Russell is prone to blindly believing things he reads in poorly sourced journals and blogs, something which makes very little sense for someone seeking the truth, but makes a lot of sense for someone who views all mainstream media outlets as part of a tyrannical cabal who are at war with humanity. Independent media outlets who eschew mainstream media stories must, by contrast, be on the side of compassion, reason, and unity. So, journalists like the one regurgitating claims made by the Russian State Department, or the one throwing out imaginary stats about the Ukrainian economy, or the one alleging a Yemeni refusal of IMF terms that never actually happened, all of these people, in Russell's mind, are trustworthy by default. They are not part of the centralized power structures trying to manipulate him. Therefore, they have no reason to lie to him. Here, Russell is exceptionally poorly served by his narrativistic principles, because these journalists do lie to him all the time, and he never thinks to ask any questions of them. He never sees the lies coming. The same deterministic logic works with nation states on a global level. There are times when Russell acknowledges that Vladimir Putin, the leader of Russia, who has invaded, occupied and bombed numerous territories, as well as in his own country, legally codifying hatred towards gay people, decriminalizing violence against women, and assassinating his political rivals, is probably not a great guy.
I'm obviously not saying that Vladimir Putin is a great guy.
However, the fact still stands that Putin does not hold centralized power on a global scale that Western governments do. According to Russell's power determinism doctrine, less power equals less evil. And therefore, Putin has less reason to lie or manipulate people. And Russell's commentary reflects this, portraying Putin as a favourable alternative to Western governments.
The real tyrant that you need to be concerned about is not Vladimir Putin and whether or not he's shat himself lately, but the new tyranny afforded by this kind of technological dictatorship.
Again, Russell is making political judgments not by analysing the morality of each person's own actions, but rather by making a prima facie determination of their morality and power level in a predetermined, pitched grand narrative. Putin, regardless of any actions he commits, can never be as evil or manipulative as the West. That is an inflexible fact of his position in Russell's anarchist conception of the global hierarchy. The same logic is applied to domestic political issues. When Russell hears of a food contamination problem, the gears are already spinning in his head to point the finger at regulatory authorities. Not because there's any concrete evidence to suggest they are to blame, but because they are the centralized power in food production, and therefore all malfeasance up and down the food production chain must be orchestrated on their command. The farmers, who are the actual direct producers of arsenic-laden rice, aren't even looked at, because in Russell's centralized power narrative, they are non-centralized enough to be perceived as normal humans again, and therefore imbued with compassion, reason, fraternity, who would never try to affect the world in any negative way for their own personal gain. Needless to say, Russell's doctrine of power determinism works hand in glove with the philosophy of political anarchism. The conspiracy theory that the FDA are poisoning babies advances the anarchist position that regulatory agencies and centralized systems of oversight should be abolished.
Withdraw all those products immediately, sue all of the companies involved, and set up new systems.
Russell's claim that half of all taxes goes to evil military companies supports the corollary anarchist position that taxation is theft.
Public money, your taxes, you at work doing your job. Where does it go again?
Russell's allegations that nation states are involved in orchestrating civil wars abroad advances the anarchist idea that nation states as entities are inexorably bound to commit one evil global crime after the next.
Are you slowly awakening to the realities of geopolitics and the way that it is underwritten by required outcomes of corporate interest?
The irony of all of this is that Russell's audience are made to feel like Russell is analysing facts and information which lead him on to revelatory political conclusions, when it's actually entirely the other way around. Russell has this one myopic political conclusion about the world, which dictates all the information he is willing to share, the group of journalists he trusts to give that information to him, and a brazen willingness to tell lies whenever reality becomes inconvenient to his political message. Anarchism and centralized power narratives provide Russell with a firm philosophical foundation to feel morally vindicated while quoting hack job statistics, misrepresenting journalists' work, and obscuring evidence from his viewers. The conceptualization of Western power structures as a tyrannically evil behemoth means that all dishonest tactics Russell himself employs in this fight can be easily legitimized in his own head. And Russell, a celebrity who lives in a £3 million castle in the same neighborhood as Swiss financiers, property tycoons, and the descendants of landowning gentry, can frame himself as the voice of the everyman.
The ability for people like you and me to speak freely.
Valiantly campaigning on YouTube to abolish the state and thus solve all of humanity's problems. This is, I think, how Russell internally justifies the work he does to himself. He's not just making videos, he's awakening people to a radical and noble cause, and therefore serving a magnanimous purpose, in no way comparable to other rent-seeking talking heads in left and right-wing media.
I'm neither left nor right, because I don't believe in centralized bipartisan democracy.
However, our analysis of Russell's social media footprint would be incomplete if we were not to acknowledge that there are definite limits to his anarchist principles. Over the last few years, because of the way Russell has covered specific issues including the pandemic, the mainstream media, and the American Democratic Party, he has attracted a viewer base which skews heavily American, heavily populist, and overwhelmingly right of centre. This is an inevitable and perhaps even intentional consequence of Russell's conspicuously red-tinged anarchist messaging. There's a lot of issues that have historically been interwoven with anarchism that you don't actually hear about on Russell's channel. Sexual liberation, the patriarchy, racial inequality. Big topics for other anarchist thinkers, but not for Russell. On the other hand, there's a different category of anarchist issues which Russell talks about a lot. The evils of the government, why you shouldn't have to pay taxes, the illegitimacy of American democracy. These happen to be anarchist positions that, if delivered in the right way, coincidentally become a one-to-one fit with things that right-wing populists believe. There has been a frenzied pushing and pulling of influence between Russell Brand and his audience since 2020, and truth be told, it's difficult to say which one of them is having more of an effect on the other. What is clear is that while Russell might resent it when people label him as right-wing,
let's talk about how right-wing I am. There's been a spate of articles about me saying I'm right-wing. I've been condemned for being right-wing.
He is only too happy to compromise his anarchist principles to appease right-wing American conservatives. In one video, Russell quotes from an article that criticizes capitalism and comes up with a very peculiar caveat of the information he's just shared.
Youth have no future under capitalism. And I know some of you will query the use of the word capitalism there, but I suppose what the writer of this piece means is capitalism as it currently is functioning. And it's difficult to query that, isn't it?
So, according to Russell, the writer of this piece doesn't actually mean capitalism, the economic system. The writer's critique is instead aimed at the specific functioning of capitalism right now. The source is listed as ws.org, and when you go to that URL, you instantly see that the letters stand for World Socialist Website. The author of the article Russell is quoting from is Tom Hall, who has written in other articles, and I'm paraphrasing here, the fight against capitalist exploitation requires the fight by the working class for the socialist reconstruction of society. Workers are in a fight not only against management but against the capitalist state. The working class should be mobilized in a broader fight against capitalism. Leon Trotsky said we should let capitalism perish. We need to develop an industrial and political counteroffensive against the capitalist system for socialism.
I suppose what the writer of this piece means is capitalism as it currently is functioning.
No, I think the writer means capitalism, the way we all straightforwardly understand that word. I think you know that too, because you're quoting from a publication called World Socialist Website, a forum run by socialists where they critique capitalism. It should be the case that Russell's commentary, which revolves around anarchism and oppressive centralized power structures, necessitates the ripping apart of capitalism, given capitalism's role as the motherboard which connects and powers so many other centralized global systems. But the unavoidable reality of Russell's situation is that he is addressing his message to an audience of American conservatives who love capitalism, love individualism, love pursuit of the bag. So here, when a clear critique of capitalism is evoked by a writer, Russell conspicuously hedges the claim and pulls his punch, obligingly adapting his anarchist principles to placate the sensibilities of libertarian viewers. Another topic on which Russell experiences selective schizophrenia is the mainstream media. Most of the time, Russell pursues a characteristically anarchist line of attack against the MSM, calling it a tool of the state, saying it only serves the interests of the powerful, and that its function is just to distract and confuse people and make everyone dumb.
The mainstream media and government often put out information that's intended to distract us and confuse us, to make you be compliant and passive, to keep us dumb when we should be awakening.
However, there is one mainstream media channel which Russell inexplicably shields from the brunt of his criticism. Look at this video clip we saw earlier where Russell talks about the mainstream media profiting from the war in Ukraine, where Russell specifically singles out the viewership gains made by CNN and MSNBC.
CNN's audience soared from 633,000 in January to 1.75 million last week, up 178%, and MSNBC had 980,000 for its war coverage, up 51% over January.
What is not highlighted in Russell's video, or ever shown to the audience, is the sentence that comes before this one. That sentence talks about Fox News averaging more viewers than both CNN and MSNBC during the invasion of Ukraine, increasing Fox News viewership by 13 percentage points more than its left-wing competitor. Russell took out this sentence about Fox News and only quoted those clauses relating to the liberal-leaning TV networks. The decision not to highlight the gains made by Fox News is an important one, because it means that Russell's American conservative viewers can conceptualize accusations of the media's greedy warmongering as a symptom of liberalism, narrowing the scope of Russell's anarchist critique against all media stations to really be more of a critique against against left-wing media stations. In discussing the US's invasion of Iraq, Russell highlights the big role played by liberal media stations in propagating pro-war sentiment.
Fair found that there was a literal absolute consensus about war among the major centre-left stations ABC, CBS, NBC and CNN almost 20 years ago. That's astonishing, isn't it? Like the left, with its assumed connection to fairness, justice, progress, and surely progress above all else should be progression in the direction of peace and harmony.
And yet, at the apparent peak of the liberal media's pro-war propaganda campaign, they only appear to have managed to persuade 52% of Democrats to support the war, whereas 83% of Republicans supported the war. I wonder what TV station the Republicans were watching.
In the end, Saddam will be removed from power, and the world will be a better place. And I hope God approves of that.
Gotcha. Not only does Russell shield Fox News from the criticism he gives to other networks, he has declared himself to be in a new alliance with Fox News.
On this voyage to truth and freedom, which will involve new alliances, which is exactly why I was appearing on Fox News and having conversations with other commentators and pundits from across the political spectrum.
If you're an anarchist, then all forms of mass media are part of the power structure. The most viewed American multinational mass media company in history, Fox, is definitely part of the power structure. I imagine there is some room in anarchism for pragmatic alliances, but undeniably, it's difficult to destroy centralized power when you're busy making friends with it. Russell's coddling of the right also extends to whitewashing Republican lawmakers. In this video, Russell tells his audience that American politicians are investing in fossil fuels companies and depicts it as a bipartisan issue.
Of the 100 Congress people invested in fossil fuel companies, 59 are Republicans and 41 are Democrats. More or less the same then.
First of all, those raw numbers, not the same. 59 Republicans investing in fossil fuels is a 50% increase on the number of Democrats doing the same thing. But the more devious muddying of the water here is that if you look at the original article by Sludge, you'll see that Russell has cut out the end of the sentence. It actually says, of the 100 Congress people invested in fossil fuels companies, 59 are Republicans and 41 are Democrats, and all of the top 10 members with the most invested in the industry are Republicans.
More or less the same then.
Not the same. They're not the same in raw numbers. They're not the same by the scale of their investments. This is another scenario where an anarchist would not seek to hide information about any power structure politicians. But when Russell is reading articles that plainly show Republicans to be the worst of two evils on any given issue, he trims out key information to level the playing field. Additionally, for an anarchist seeking to abolish corporate power,
I'm also a little tiny bit concerned about the state itself and its relations with corporations.
Russell is surprisingly comfortable having his own relations with corporate enterprises. He's been sponsored by Incogni.
This is where our sponsor, Incogni, comes in.
That's a service owned by Surfshark, the Lithuanian tech group who were recently valued at $3 billion. He's been sponsored by ExpressVPN.
And that's why I recommend using ExpressVPN every time you go online.
That's a product owned by Cape Technologies, a UK-based tech company owned by an Israeli multi-billionaire called Teddy Sagi.
I got no truck with the world's most powerful billionaires. I'm just a little man with a couple of mates making videos.
For all Russell's distrust of the pharmaceuticals industry, he was happy to promote a health brand called Genucell Skincare.
That is why I'm recommending Genucell Skincare.
That's a brand owned by Unimed International, whose CEO, George Faltaos, does not confine his marketing activities to independent content creators. He has frequently appeared on mainstream media channels to tout the benefits of his anti-wrinkle creams.
Things are doing fantastic since you picked up the promotion of our products.
Does Unimed International represent some new avant-garde, anarchist-approved pharmaceutical business who are rational, compassionate, and honest with their consumers? I don't think so. In response to a recommendation by an independent market watchdog, Unimed International acknowledged that they hadn't done the necessary tests to back up their use of the phrase clinically proven in their marketing materials, and subsequently withdrew the marketing campaign from publication.
That is why I'm recommending Genucell Skincare.
Russell was also happy to recommend Heights brain care supplements.
Heights! With just 2 capsules a day, you can enjoy clarity.
This is another health products company which is found to be in breach of regulatory standards for making health claims that were not supported by the product they were selling. If you read the decision from the Advertising Standards Agency Council, you'll find that Russell is named in it because he did an ad read describing Heights capsules as a probiotic, which they are not. And Russell also said Heights capsules help with gut health, mental health, and immunity, claims which the manufacturers had no authorization to make based on what they were selling.
Heights couldn't be further away from the evils of Big Pharma. They're all about transparency.
Yeah, they would never lie. Also, unlike Big Pharma, these guys are paying me. Take a second to look beyond Russell Brand's flowery language about the upcoming revolution and wisecracks.
We believe firmly there should be a war, because if there isn't one, we're gonna have to lose Janice from accounts.
Which I imagine would be very funny if this was your kind of humour. And think about the duplicitousness of his political advocacy. This is not some free-loving, open-minded dreamer with his head in the clouds. This is a man who is extremely shrewd, calculating, and selective in how he applies his self-proclaimed anarchist beliefs. He wants to destroy all centralized power structures, but will make a caveat for capitalism. The function of all mainstream media is to make everyone dumb, but there's room for an alliance with the biggest, most influential MSM company in the history of America. No excuses should ever be made for politicians, but no need to look at this sentence that makes Republicans look especially bad. All tech corporations are evil and you can't trust them with your data. That's why I recommend using ExpressVPN every time you use the internet. The whole pharmaceuticals industry are just liars trying to sell you things you don't need to make you sick. But not this company here. This is a great company. You should use their capsules every day for a clear mind and healthy digestive tract. All billionaires are evil. Not this one. All politicians are evil. Not that one. There's only so many exceptions you can carve out from a political belief system before it becomes incoherent as a descriptive label. An anarchist who only directs anarchist critiques at convenient targets is not an anarchist. That is a partisan demagogue using anarchist philosophy as a rhetorical shield to deflect criticism. I have no doubt that Russell's potent mix of delusional self-importance and intoxicating savior complex makes him genuinely feel that he is winning over Republicans to his anarchist cause, that conservatives are becoming more compassionate every day by watching Russell's channel, and one day we're going to see the big flicking of the switch where all conservatives realize that peace and love and anarchy are the way forward for society.
I'm trying to cultivate a sense that you have more to gain by forgiving and loving the people that you perceive to be on the other end of a cultural spectrum to you than you have by vanquishing them.
Pure fantasy. You're not changing conservatives. All you've done is distort your political message more and more until it's not even anarchism anymore. It's just three conservative midgets in a trench coat. There's a reason why you reassure people that the words they're reading on screen don't mean what they clearly say, why you hide text, why there are topics within your own self-professed political belief system that you won't touch with a 10-foot barge pole. It's because if you were ever fully open about the anarchy part of your anarchism, it would stop being a one-to-one fit with conservative populism. And it's conservative populism, albeit a spiritual, kooky, new age conservative populism, that you're actually propping up. Russell's anarchist principles are a husk, just like his paper-thin veneer of skepticism, his credulous quest to find truth, and his knowledge of the economy, geopolitics, and every other issue he talks about on his channel. While we're being honest about Russell's politics, we shouldn't just leave this as implied. Even if Russell was honest in his application of the anarchist beliefs he claims to have, the anarchist beliefs in and of themselves are stupid. They ask us to believe that the world is full of compassionate, rational, and unified people who suddenly, when placed in a centralized government, become cruel, irrational segregationists, as if Adolf in the beer halls was a fundamentally different person to Adolf in the Reichstag, his brain apparently changing as he stepped through the doors of power, suddenly becoming an evil member of the centralized power structure, rather than the saint-like, proletarian voice of compassion and unity he had been before. I don't think that the working class, or the middle class for that matter, have a natural tendency towards rationality or compassion. And nor do I think there is a natural bond of fraternity tying us all together. I think that everyone has a choice, whether they want to be reasonable and compassionate towards others. And many, naturally, choose not to be those things. If Russell's theories about humanity's innate compassion are true, why is it that on social media platforms where we are most free to be our natural selves, the worst of all human behaviors and instincts always seem to rise to the top? Why is it that whenever a cult manages to break free of centralized power structures holding them down, they always seem to end up committing more abuses of power against their members than anything the state could ever dream of doing? Why is it that when the Haitian government recently collapsed, we didn't see the Haitian people coming together in a compassionate, unified front, happy to be free of their centralist overlords, but instead cowering in fear as criminal gangs filled the power vacuum and started kidnapping, murdering, and assaulting everyone? For better or worse, it feels like humans are happier and live more prosperous lives when there are states and governments and laws and rules tethering us all to a shared universe of existence. And that's without even getting started on the impracticality and naivety of each of the pontificating suggestions Russell makes about how we should reorganize society.
Who benefits from having one centralised government? Why are we not having libertarian, anarcho-syndicalist systems of government?
No central government means no national military to protect you, so your little anarcho-syndicalist community, which you've purposefully made as small as possible,
where communities are made as small as possible,
it's going to need to be armed to the teeth and ready for combat, otherwise other communities who have not made themselves so small can roll up with AK-47s and force you into slavery. No government means people regulate themselves and vote for whatever they want.
It just means a world where people regulate themselves and vote for what they want.
So let's say Jimmy Savile, Gary Glitter and the lead singer of Lost Prophets get together to form their own anarcho-syndicalist community. What are they going to vote for, and what's life going to be like for the kids in that community? No government means everyone controls their own money.
To take control of their own money.
So if you happen to be disabled or just old, you'd better hope that everyone randomly becomes way more giving overnight, because your days of them being legally obliged to pay into your social security disability insurance are done. Recall, if you will, the problems Russell is trying to solve. A fake baby poisoning conspiracy, politicians switching words around to confuse him, and the media reporting on global events too much. And now look at his solution to those problems. Extremely niche problems, one could say. Not the same problems typically experienced by working class people. These are very Henley-on-Thames problems. Russell's solution is abolish the government and just leave everyone to fend for themselves in this new lawless world of infinite potential for criminality, selfishness, and moral decline.
The reason he is a hero to millions of people, millions who will be watching this channel, is because of his position on politics in the last 3 years.
It's a bold position, I'll give him that. The good news is that anarchism is never going to happen, because ultimately, whenever someone claiming to be an anarchist is forced to contend with the realities of getting anything done in real life, they inevitably have to build something approximating the same systems that they were trying to destroy. Russell's own YouTube channel is ironically one of the greatest examples of this one could ever hope to find. I remember a time when YouTube was the new frontier of journalism, a place where independent people could broadcast their thoughts from an intimate setting, without high-budget cameras or studios, without a team of writers and researchers, without advertisers, without the impassioned, bombastic delivery that dominates cable news cycles.
I'm looking through today's papers, Tuesday, February the 25th, and I'm going to go through them.
This was a place to escape from the fear-mongering, sensationalist headlines of tabloid rags and find perspectives that were authentic, down-to-earth and real.
The amount of money that Britain gives in foreign aid is minute. It's 0.7% of the GDP. It's like not a significant figure. So I don't know why they get such pleasure from stirring up these sort of tribalistic, oppositional perspectives.
And then what happened? Well, I guess we decided that a little bit of bombastic delivery was actually acceptable.
Hello, welcome to The Truths. Is Donald Trump actually going to become president? Of course he bloody well isn't, but he might make politics even more bloody ridiculous while he's trying.
That's just good showmanship. And I mean, if you can afford a good camera, why not? Makes the videos more watchable. And is there anything that wrong with hiring a small team of writers and researchers? That gives the main presenter more time to focus on delivery and getting content out the door. And now those teams of writers need to be paid. So it's only fair to start taking paid sponsorships from advertisers, so there's a little bit more money to go around. And you know what? There's nothing wrong with upgrading to a proper studio. That just shows we're professionals and take our work seriously. And as it turns out, those long sentence case video titles aren't getting that much attention. So it might help if we went with something a little bit more tabloidy, you know, capitalized, sensationalistic.
Good news, everyone! A new social media platform where you're guaranteed to be censored. You're gonna have to de-amplify my anger, baby! I'm getting pretty furious!
Monger a little bit of fear so we can get more eyeballs on each story we cover, and our audience might not appreciate some of our personal opinions.
What I've found surprising as a new father of a female child.
Congrats.
I don't like any ornamentation of femininity on her, because it feels like something's being put on her that's not, she's not choosing. The important thing, the thing that all of us have to learn, is a kind of non-judgment and a willingness to let go of our systems of categorization.
No worries, let's just rein those opinions in and focus on other viewpoints that the audience does like.
I believe that's what's behind a spectacle like this is a kind of attempt to derail the sacred. If you let go of that, the idea that there is a supreme ulterior being that guides us all, then how do you undergird principles that are required for us to survive?
And I hope God approves of that.
Congratulations, Russell. You just recreated the mainstream media. You're doing all the same shit for all the same reasons they do it. we all recreate the mainstream media. We can keep moving to new platforms and denying that that is what is happening, but the result will inevitably always be the same. Because the mainstream media and the government and the power structure are not distortions of who we are. They are reflections. The only way that we get to a better, more compassionate world is through immense effort to be more rational, more reasonable, and more kind than our natural impulses lead us to be. Pretending that our God-given human nature is just going to do all that hard work for us once we get rid of the evil news companies and evil government and evil concept of having a centralized legal framework that everyone has to adhere to, this intellectually bankrupt, self-indulgent oppositional thinking is based on a dangerous misunderstanding of what drives people to do bad things in the first place. Any one of us could be that person at the top of the chain, turning people against each other. All it takes is an emotional incentive pushing us to do so, and that doesn't have to come from a power structure. It more often comes from ordinary people around us, who allow their natural human impulses to lead their thoughts and opinions. A sad but true statement of the world we live in is that the more money and influence you have, the more you get to live in your own little anarchist utopia by default, because you're just not tethered to the same environmental conditions and rules as the rest of us. Russell Brand is not a social influencer out of financial necessity. He's not an anarchist by obligation. His work is not essential to anyone's well-being. He's not leading a revolution. Russell does what he does because he likes it. He likes reinventing himself as something other than the bloke who was in Forgetting Sarah Marshall. He likes being politically influential. He likes posing as a revolutionary online because it helps him attach a magnanimous purpose to his day-to-day existence as a multi-millionaire in privileged high society. You want to know what Russell Brand would do in the wake of an actual global anarchist revolution? You're already seeing it. Sponsorships and all-caps headlines and meandering, borderline incomprehensible monologues about the nature of power. The revolution could happen on Wednesday, and by Thursday, Russell will be back on YouTube and Rumble saying they did the revolution wrong and the new system is still too centralized for his liking and people should subscribe to his channel to get a newer, better revolution underway, Revolution 2.0. Underneath it all, the main problem Russell Brand is grappling with is not the centralized power structure, it's being a man who already has everything the world could possibly give him, but still not feeling like it's enough. And you know what? You can destroy the government, you can destroy the tax system, you can destroy Big Pharma, but at the end of all that, you're still gonna be you. Russell is funny though.
Was that done on purpose? You said that was an accident when you stood on my foot, but I reckon it was done on purpose. Make up, never break up. If you do, ignore the treaty between Reagan and Gorbachev and escalate tension.
Or I imagine he would be funny if this was just out of comedy.
What? Hey yo, white people going crazy in the comments.
Yes. Thanks for watching to the end of my vid. I really appreciate your eyeballs and time. The names scrolling up the screen right now, they're my Patreon gang. Thank you so much to each and every one of the people on this list for supporting me as I work at glacial speed to release video critiques. If you enjoy watching the things I make, please consider supporting me like these lovely people on Patreon. Failing that, just like the vid, sub to my channel, show your appreciation in the comments. I like all that stuff too. It's been a really long time. It's good to be back. I've had a very, very busy year, disconnected from social media for a lot of it, but I'm always reminded how much I enjoy this hobby when I come back and see you all here. What can I say? I'm lucky to have you all. This vid's Patreon question comes from Mitch, who asks, it's not likely, and it would definitely be mostly awkward, and definitely, at least, a little bit interesting, but were I to find myself in your vicinity, would you let me buy you a drink? And if so, how would I do that? I picked this one out because I thought there was a few directions I can go with this one, and it's beautifully, meanderingly worded. Potentially quite a romantic question we're dealing with today, depending on whether Mitch's intentions with me are friendship or lust. But I think, interestingly enough, the answer for either one of those will be kind of similar. So I really like people who engage in self-deprecating humor. There's something about people putting themselves on blast that just sort of gives me an instant chemistry with them that is unbreakable, whatever other character flaws they have. If we're both in the pub and you're getting the pints in and you spill one a bit and then you're like, oh, looks like my tiny hands couldn't manage these, better get my next one in a baby sippy cup. I would be like, wow, we would be best friends from that moment onwards. These are the people I love. People who say things like, wow, that's something even I can't mess up. and it just feels nice to be invited somewhere outside of my house. You'll have to apologize to your other guests after I leave. And any jokes where people make out that their penis is small, they always crack me up. So yeah, if we're in a bar and you want to buy me a drink, somewhat paradoxically, the route to go down is spill a drink on yourself and then act like a loser. You know, different strokes for different folks. I'm a self-deprecation connoisseur. Thanks for the question, Mitch, and thanks again everyone for watching. I've got a new Zelda bootleg to play you all on the way out, which I made with my friend Modell when he came round to my house. Hope you get a kick out of it. I'll see you all again whenever I get round to making the next vid. Bye.